Hello, welcome to my pipeline integrity video series. This video is on crack stability considerations for cracks in oil and gas pipelines. This is part 3 of my series where I'm looking at some issues associated with stress corrosion cracking colonies and how cracks might be expected to grow under SCC conditions. My name is Colin Scott. I'm your presenter. I'm a pipeline integrity engineer based out of Calgary, Alberta, up in Canada. Now, I mentioned that this is part 3 of my video series. In the first part of the video series, I looked at the behavior of a single edge crack and considered a back wall correction factor in that analysis. And what I showed is that as a crack propagates, it goes through regions of stability from low stability growth to high stability growth to low stability growth. In the second of the video series, I looked at a periodic edge crack array in a semi-infinite body. And then I demonstrated that as a crack grows, multiple periodic cracks next to one another in an array, as you would expect to see in a stress corrosion cracking colony, will actually influence each other and lead to a shielding effect, which can result in some crack dormancy and also a phenomenon called crack shedding. That's a little bit tricky to understand if you haven't seen it before. So if you haven't seen video 2, I encourage you to take a look at that at some point. In this video, I'm going to look at a combination of the two. So that means I'm going to look at an array of a periodic array of edge cracks, but then I'm going to account for a back wall correction factor. And so this is my best estimate of trying to understand how cracks will grow within stress corrosion cracking colonies in oil and gas pipelines. Here we have a quick recap of the first 2 videos. On the upper left, I show the normalized stress intensity as it changes with crack depth for a single edge crack, and that's with a back wall correction factor. If you look at the lower right, you'll see the normalized stress intensity factor as a function of crack depth, but in this case for a periodic crack array. The stress intensity factor for a periodic crack array does depend on the crack spacing. Here I've chosen an arbitrary crack spacing of 2, say, millimeters. That should be reasonable for a lot of our stress corrosion cracking examples, and I think it serves as a pretty reasonable number to work with here. So as part 3 of this video series, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 2 curves and I'm going to combine them together to see how the full effect would be of a periodic crack array in a finite wall thickness pipe wall. A couple things I have to look at first, though, and really point out to you. When we look at the normalized stress intensity factor for the single edge crack in the back wall correction, you'll see that near the start of the growth, we have a fairly shallow positive slope when we're between about 1 millimeter in this case and 3 millimeters. So I just need you to keep a mental eye on that. We're going to have a shallow positive slope fairly early on in the crack growth behavior. Here we have the periodic crack array, and let me remind you that this analysis is for a semi-infinite body, so it's obviously not entirely appropriate for looking at a finite thickness pipe wall in an oil and gas pipeline. But here, when we look at that region of crack depth between 1 and 3, in this particular case, we have a very, very shallow slope, and in this case, it's a negative slope. So that becomes very, very important. When we look at the combination of how edge cracks with a back wall correction factor and periodic crack arrays with no back wall correction factor might influence each other, we can do a fairly simple piece of mathematics here and think to ourselves, if we have a shallow positive slope due to the standard stress intensity square root depth relationship, and we combine that with a shallow negative slope due to the crack shielding effects, the combination of those is going to give us a near zero slope. And what that's going to mean is that we're going to have some crack stability, crack dormancy. And those of you that have studied stress corrosion cracking in the past know that that's a very common phenomenon that's seen in a lot of different pipeline situations. Cracks will grow to 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter or so, and then they'll go dormant. There are various explanations for why the dormancy would occur, but to my knowledge, this is the first time anybody has describe the crack stability dormancy issue in terms of fracture mechanics principles, as opposed to looking at electrochemical mechanisms that are going on at the crack tip. In order for this phenomenon to occur and to have that crack stability, I need to remind you that the toughness gradient at the crack tip is going to be a positive. So in order to get crack growth, we know from our basic fraction mechanics that we have to have a K gradient that is larger than our toughness gradient. In this case, when we have a near zero slope, it's not going to be the case, and therefore we will get some crack stability. Now, if I put these two together and I consider the concept of shedding, which I briefly mentioned before, and I described quite a bit in video number 2, we can see that in the first case, we'll have a blue curve, and as a crack grows, we'll see that for the shallow crack, the shielding effects will dominate, and we'll get a fairly flat curve, and that's going to mean a fairly stable curve. But as we know from video 2, that flat curve, stable curve, can induce some shedding. In this case, I've shown the example of shedding with the orange curve. What happens with shedding is 2/3 of your cracks will go dormant, and the other third of your cracks on a fairly regular spacing will continue to grow with a new effective crack spacing. We see that with the orange curve. And as the orange curve goes from left to right as the crack grows, we find that that deep back wall correction factor actually starts to dominate. So as we get deeper and deeper, we will start to lose that crack stability and find ourselves potentially in a bad situation. Obviously, that depends on a lot of factors, including the nominal wall thickness of the pipe wall and the crack spacing and how much stress we've got going on. But the key lesson is that for shallow cracks, that shielding factor will dominate, and it's not until you get deeper that you start to lose stability. So that gives you some understanding of why a lot of stress corrosion cracks will grow so slowly and go dormant. Here, if we look at the normalized stress intensity factor gradient with respect to the crack depth, we'll see that for the very shallow cracks, it's quite high, but as that crack grows, it's actually going to stabilize. You'll see both the blue and the orange curves are near zero and fairly flat, indicating that we're going to have a lot of crack stability. Now, this is for one particular case only, and anybody that wants to look at this analysis considering different crack depths, different material wall thickness, different stresses applied, and particularly different crack spacing are going to get some different results here. So what are the implications of all this? Well, we know from this discussion and the first 2 videos in the series that crack stability is a function of crack depth and length. It depends on the component geometry. So in this case, it depends on the wall thickness of the pipe. And the component geometry and crack sizing, that includes looking at the crack colony spacing. If we look at a close colony spacing, that allows for shallower cracks to stabilize, go dormant. And if we have a thicker wall, that also allows shallower cracks to go stable and go dormant. So I have to ask the philosophical question of, can the crack dormancy in stress corrosion cracking be predicted or inferred in our various pipeline integrity cases, or ideally, could it be encouraged? Can we find some combination of behavior within the mathematics that would allow us to encourage crack stability and provide for a safer pipeline that is subject to stress corrosion cracking? Is there some colony spacing, wall thickness, or stress combination that we can deem to be, relatively speaking, safe? Obviously, we can't use the word safe in a black and white issue, but when we're dealing with crack management and probabilistics, we're dealing with shades of gray. Is there some scenario where we consider cracks to be not a primary threat to the pipeline? So that's something for you to chew on for a little while. My gut tells me that there will be scenarios where we have a suitable combination of crack spacing and applied stress that would result in a stable crack formation. If we can determine that mathematically and then verify that both with field work and with laboratory work, we might find ourselves in a situation where a lot of our stress corrosion cracking issues disappear from our systems simply because of the conditions of crack depth, colony spacing, and the stress that we're applying. Obviously, that's a big challenge to get through, but I encourage you to have a good think about that and see if you agree with me. And if not, please let me know through either LinkedIn or YouTube comment section that you see some sort of theoretical issue here that we need to think about. If you're interested in some further viewing, I would like to encourage you to see the first two parts of this video series. You can find those on YouTube. They were posted fairly recently. I'd also like to recommend one of my YouTube videos that's called STC Shielding Factors. And what this does is this builds on the work of Parker from 1999, and it demonstrates the phenomenon of crack shedding. Now, I'll have to tell you that this is for advanced viewers only. You really have to have some pretty good understanding of fracture mechanics to follow the arguments, but I encourage that for those of you that are in the business. I'll also mention that I have my own fracture mechanics failure pressure model that I developed a few years ago. It's called the GEM, and you can see how I've used some of this work to adapt my GEM model and use an effective depth of cracks in order to get a better prediction for failure pressure. Please take a look at that as well if you're interested. I think that's probably enough from me for now. Thank you very much if you've made it this far. I'm always open to having conversations about what people may or may not agree with what I'm doing here. So please have a good think about things, and if you need to contact me, please do. Until then, thanks very much for your time. Have a good day.